This is Changeling the Podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the Podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host, Josh, and with us is your other host, Pooka. Say hi, Pooka.
Hello.
What are we doing this evening, Pooka?
Afternoon, Josh.
Afternoon.
Today we are talking with Andrew Goodman, author of the recently released kithbook Dullahan on Storyteller's Vault, and also the author of Paved with Good Intentions, At Roots of Legend.
Welcome, Andrew.
Hello there.
So we'll be talking about kithbook Dullahan. So we're gonna, before we get into that, I have a question about it. I see it's part of Year of the Road. Is that a Storyteller Vault project or?
Year of the Road was a Vault event. I suppose it was a publishing prompt to create works around the theme and ideas of the open road. I'm a little behind the curve on that, but it was one of the things that gave me the idea for doing the book in the first place.
Okay.
I don't know that they're actually doing those initiatives anymore, but they're still listed as options when you upload text, so I say go for it.
So, Andrew, tell us about this book.
So, Kithbook Dullahan is, it's a kithbook, so it's trying to be in the vein of all the other kithbooks that have gone before it, and introduce and take a deep dive into a particular changeling kith for players and storytellers to use in their games. In this particular case, the dullahan, which is originally an Irish folktale and supposedly inspiration behind the headless horseman. Off the back of that, as we'll see, quite a number of other things got roped into it, sort of tangentially, but I was surprised to find out how many myths and legends really tied in with this kith, as we'll see.
Was it a mythological figure that you had already been aware of and wanted to do a kith write-up for, or did you kind of discover it through the process of doing other writing and just think, oh wow, that would make a really good kith to explore?
So, I had heard of a dullahan before. I knew the name. I knew vaguely that it was a thing that didn't have a head. What I didn't know was that it was a fairy specifically. I think I'd always assumed it's just sort of some sort of ghost. And it wasn't until, actually, it was watching a Halloween episode of one of my favorite YouTube channels, a series called Monstrum, which is now picked up by, I think PBS does it now, that covers sort of the sociology and development around different myths and legends, that I found out that the dullahan was actually a fairy. At which point, as any, I think, changeling player will have happen, as soon as you hear about a new fairy folklore, you go, ooh, that sounds like a new playable kith. So then I started digging into myths and legends a bit more, and it became a bit of a rabbit hole, particularly when you then start tying in things with horseman and the hunt. Very quickly, the wild hunt got involved, which you can see in a bit of chapter 3 when we get to that. There's also the fact that the dullahan, being a headless horseman, is, of course, you can't have a horseman without their horse, which then opened the whole can of worms that is fey steeds, and then just for good measure, fey hounds, which I think I'd never really had a satisfactory amount of writing on them in previous Wall of Darkness editions, so it seemed like a good opportunity to go down that rabbit hole as well. In fact, I think I ended up going down so many rabbit holes and rabbit warrens that the kith book ended up spawning an entire secondary book, the book you mentioned, Paved with Good Intentions, which had originally been an attempt to summarize driving and riding rules just for convenience at the back of the book, and then discovered that one fateful evening was sat in my living room floor with 5 different source books out, none of which had agreeing or uniform driving and riding rules, and it all sort of went downhill from there, and now I have 2 books.
Yeah, why write one supplement when you could write 2?
Exactly. But I digress. The dullahan folklore started proving to have, it has a lot of tantalizing sort of bits of stories. I picked up a couple of years ago, a compilation of Irish fairy tales when I was visiting Belfast, and there's an entire section on the dullahan and headless horseman, which I, needless to say, read ravenously as I was working on the book, including full-on poems and songs and a multitude of stories, which just sort of breathes extra life into the book. Then you follow all the headless horseman stuff, where the story starts evolving quite a bit in the Americas. There's a surprising number, a figure in Central American folklore of the Padre Sin Cabeza, where you have the headless priest, which is ended up inspiring an NPC later on in the book. Yeah, so it kept growing and growing, and before I knew it, well, it needed to be a kith book. So here we are now.
Okay.
Well, so with reference to those various threads of folklore that all seem to kind of accrue around this figure of the dullahan, something that I had noticed getting into chapter 1, the different sort of mythemes that kind of weave their way through the history that you present. So what I got out of it, at least, was this sort of primal idea of almost like the anthropomorphization of the sounds of a distant hunt passing by, so to hear all of those horses and hounds and shouting moving through the night, giving rise to legends of the wild hunt and its riders, forming one piece of them as a kith. And then you have kind of this distributors of justice, and then a third one being testing the virtuous, like in the Green Man myths. So you have all of these elements of like vengeance and fear, but also order kind of woven through.
Yeah, I do want to. We skipped over the little short story and the picture at the beginning.
Oh,
I
true.
just want to call out the little headless girl riding a tricycle, terrorizing people.
It was a nice touch to have the kind of horror movie opening in the prologue.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that one was a lot of fun, both to paint and to write the little story at the start. I always get chills when I'm going through those tunnels along the sides of canals. And in England, almost all the street lamps, for some reason, are this sort of sulphurous Halloween orange year-round, which does just make it extra spooky. I just tried to think of, what dual... As you see with the NPCs, I tried to have a diverse array of different ideas of the headless horseman, and I thought a creepy little girl out for vengeance would fit it quite well, particularly the slightly jarring aspect of her sitting on a little tricycle instead of a horse.
Yeah.
So did you do a lot of the art in this book yourself?
I did almost all of the artwork myself.
Oh, wow. Very good.
Oh, thank you.
That's nice callbacks to some of the original kith books with that sketchbook style that has like diagrams mixed in with, or diagrammatic elements mixed in with the actual portrait.
I love those old
Yeah.
book illustrations. So yeah, I really wanted to try and pay homage to those ones.
The glass icons as well are beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And the border, like all the work on that, that's a lot of nice touches here.
Thank you. It's definitely a work of passion, wanting I like the books to actually look nice when you're staring at them. So, yeah, a lot of work went into the art. So, thank you for saying so.
Yeah. Anyway, chapter 1.
Yeah, this chapter's the Headless Horseman. It's the kith book part of the kith book. The most kith book. Like it actually has the birthrights and frailties, description of the kith, a lot of the background there specifically on them. So
if I had to kind of pick 3 phrases to describe how they came across to me from reading this, I think agents of justice would be one. The terror of the prey would be another, like the terror that they instill in others, kind of in that predator-prey hunter dynamic. And then loners on the open road. And I think that sums up who the kith are, but I'm not the one who invented them. So, Andrew, how would you... I think one of our listeners asked if you had to give an elevator pitch for the kith, what would it be?
Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well there. I think that covers most of the folklore and urban legends that ended up inspiring dullahan. I think another sort of secondary trait that became quite big for them was also their connection with their steed or their hound. Being, I suppose that as sort of an aspect of the loner on the open road. They do have one true companion with them at all times. Which is quite a big part of the kith.
Was there any there's a lot of inspirations in here. Was one of them Ghost Rider from Marvel Comics?
Absolutely was.
Okay.
it sort of became unavoidable at a moment after I'd read enough of the folklore, and you start getting into sort of later adaptations and how the stories evolve into the modern age, and there's no escaping the fact that Ghost Rider is definitely inspired, at least in part, by early tellings of the Headless Horseman and the Dullahan. So there's definitely some homages to him in here.
But you also managed to tie it into some pretty specific elements from Irish history and mythology. So the connection with Crumcruach and St. Patrick as well.
Yes, that was an intriguing one that I hope it's one that there's enough tantalizing sort of bits to want to tie it in, but I cannot at all claim to be an expert on the subject, so I hope I haven't done anything untoward with the legends and the myths. But when I think I just stumbled across Crom Cruach, who I'd never heard of before, starting to research this book, and discovering that they were a god of sacrifice, human sacrifice, specifically around decapitation. Just it was too good to not tie in with the Dullahan, because of course one of easily their most notable trait is their severed head. And when I sat down and had to go, all right, there has to be a reason this kith has their head detached from their body. Where do you go with that? You could just make something up entirely with the Fomori, but Crom Cruach ended up becoming quite a tantalizing bit of real world folklore that I really wanted to tie in, particularly since Crom also became the star of a repeated theme in the book of not just justice, but what happens when that ideal of justice is betrayed and corrupted,
Mm.
and how does the dreaming deal with such entities that betray that very lofty ideal? Crom sort of becomes the first example of that in the book.
Yeah, no, it's a nice. We've noticed in our reads of the other Kith books, each of them seems to start off with kind of the origin of the Kith's frailty, and so this fits nicely into that pattern. And then we go through some of the other changeling specific history stuff. I like the note that many of the Dullahan returned to Arcadia as part of the she hunting parties that were returning, but then those who stayed kind of wandered the open roads and fought for people's rights, and eventually traded their horses for vehicles.
Yes, that definitely becomes quite a key part when we get into the latter part of chapter two.
Yes.
But yeah, it I think made sense that because the Dullahan, they're not exactly nobles, but the niche they sort of fill, particularly if you look back in British history, which tends to be sort of the rough political structure of the early Fae, in the World of Darkness books. Someone who held a position of judge would often be a sort of quasi noble standing. So it made sense that being part of the courts, most of the Dullahan didn't really have a choice in the matter as to whether or not they left for Arcadia.
Hmm.
But I thought it was important that they not be, even early on, they not be entirely beholden to the she, since I wanted there to be this idea of the king is not above the law,
Hmm.
which becomes more and more important to the Dullahan as changeling history progresses.
Yeah.
There's another neat little running thing in Changeling books. I think talking about their opinion on werewolves and going, how do they know about the Fomorians with the whole Fomori thing? It's like a running joke almost, and I appreciated it when I came
It,
across that.
yeah, it has always bothered me the overlap there. Having run plenty of werewolf changeling crossover games, and I think in almost every game there has come a point where the players are getting confused with each other about the terminology, and yeah, it needed to be in there. I felt, along with that rather vague bit or tiny bit of lore from the old, I think it's the Get of Fenris book, tribe book,
Yep. Yeah, about the she would ride them.
and
Yeah.
the Get's therefore blood oath to kill all she on sight.
Was that actually in the werewolf book? I thought it
It
was in a Changeling book, and then werewolf players are like, "What are you talking about?"
It's in Book of Lost Dreams for Changeling. That's where I think it makes its first appearance.
the crossover book.
Yeah.
I know I had a Get player that swore by it, and the only reason he didn't kill all the other changeling players was because he had enough points in a cult to know the difference between a she and a not she.
Mm.
So when it came to sort of hunting parties and werewolves, it that was one of the first things that came to mind. And I quite like the idea of a dullahan sort of sitting there awkwardly in the background whilst the Shi are doing something, kind of going, this is probably not a great idea.
Well, in terms of getting into some of the mechanics of the kith, I think the obvious one to start with is, can you please explain the mechanics of having a severed chimerical head?
Yeah, that one ended up having a page-long sidebar. I tried to keep it as simple as possible, but also really wanted to try and cover as many bases as possible just because it's frustrating when a game suddenly comes to a halt because something weird has happened and you have nothing to go off of. So with the dullahan, their mortal head is still very much attached to their body. Their chimerical head, on the other hand, is in fact severed, which does lead to quite a few complications. They can just about balance their head on their neck if they're sitting still. So something like a childling sitting in school could sit in the classroom taking notes with their chimerical head on their physical shoulders and still be able to somewhat operate. Similarly, if, I don't know, they're just walking slowly around the store doing grocery shopping
Yep.
in their mortal main.
And you did later come up with a treasure to help get around that little particular problem.
Yes, which actually comes straight out of an old folklore, so I was quite happy to add that one.
Mm-hmm.
The green ribbon. One of the biggest problems one of the first problems that came up with was, of course, if your chimerical head is suddenly kicked across the room or something, this can be quite jarring and lead to some, what's the word? It's a bit disorienting. So you're taking a dex penalty or a raise the difficulty of dex rolls just until your head literally stops spinning. But then including the older dullahan, I just put it as grumps that they have a reduced difficulty. But I suppose if one awakened as a grump, that might not be the case. But yeah, so it goes into a little bit about how you might deal with needing to carry your head around, and there are some suggestions. And later on in the book, there are some merits you can take so that if you're riding around trying to steer the horse with one hand and hold your head with the other, you can take a merit that just makes that a bit easier. I still want them to be playable. And of course, the last part is what happens if your head is missing entirely, which is gone into in quite a bit of detail later on in the book with a flaw called headless. So yes, you can play a fully headless horseman, but it is going to come with complications.
There's another frailty too, Touch of Crom Coac. What's that from? Is it the gold? I'm not as familiar with the folklore behind. Not really much familiar with the folklore behind this kith. So where's the old gold frailty come from?
So that one does come straight from some of the old folklore. Some of the older Irish stories of the dullahan do paint it a lot as this vaguely Grim Reaper-esque character. He's an omen of death or a warning of death. And occasionally the more, let's call them unseelie dullahan, have been needed to be fought off by people. And for whatever reason, gold has often been associated with warding them off. Some of them have been unable to operate. Sort of when the sun rises, the dullahan is forced back because it can't stand the sunlight, is another reoccurring theme. They are very much creatures of the night. So again, when then researching for more of their backstory and reading about Crom Cruach, hearing a number of the descriptions of Crom being the gold-skinned god just seemed to fit too nicely. So, along with the head being separated, their other frailty then is that gold is painful to them, similar to the way a werewolf might be harmed by silver, and it's harder for them to cast magic onto or to attack someone wearing pure gold.
It's a little bit like cold iron, just not as quite as intense
Yeah,
for them.
They also have this birthright Jack of the Lantern, which is kind of like an entire epic scene possibility worked into a birthright, so I kind of liked that. And given that this birthright enables them to reveal ghosts, that's another point of connection with Changeling and Wraith.
and I wanted them to have some good tie-ins still with how much they are associated with death in the folklore. So with their Jack of the Lantern one, allowing them to see ghosts and quasi interact with them, although not to the same degree as Sluar, because I didn't want to step on the Sluar's toes. But there's certainly a lot of stories about the death coach is quite a common one, where a headless horseman is the coachman of a coach that ferries dead souls. Quite a number of stories involving that, so having the dullahan being able to see them seemed to fit.
Mm.
Yeah, and then the remaining birthright master of the hunt. It's good, but that one's sort of straightforward. What's going on there?
Well, it's,
Yeah,
It
yeah.
makes Animal Ken useful, so
yeah. This is the most animal ken focused anything I've ever seen in Changeling, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, it's as I said before, I was always a bit disappointed when Fey steeds and and hounds were mentioned. I have the old Kingdom of Willows book, and they're in there, but again, just enough for you to want more. So, again, as I said with the the birthright, what's a headless horseman without their horse? I didn't want to have to force a player to have to spend extra resources just to play what seems like should be a natural part of the kith. So the idea that the Fey steed and hound is quite close to the master of the hunt and therefore started reincarnating along with the dullahan. In fact, I don't think I actually said so in the book, but it would almost make sense to me that that's how Fey steeds and horses, and hounds, sorry, started going through the changeling way, was
Hmm.
loyally following their dullahan masters. And so Master of the Hunt, aside from being able to enchant a horse and being quite good with animal ken rolls, it does give you a couple free dots in the chimera background at creation specifically to get either a hound or a horse. And then when we get into those in chapter 2, I do include the chimerical background cost of each steed. So if you to make it a bit easier to pick your companion.
Hmm. Doesn't say that here, but if I was running this game, I would totally be like, you really want a chimerical falcon? Sure, we'll do that.
Yes, you suggested that the other day, and as soon as you mentioned it, I went, "Oh, that would have been so cool." Maybe in an updated version of the book in the future.
Hmm.
so after that we get some Seelie and unseelie attitudes. The Seelie attitude struck me as we fit these tenets into our duty as judges, as like the dullahan perspective, and then the unseelie was sort of more reasons why they see themselves as victims and or justifications to do what they want anyway. That was an interesting balance to see.
Yeah, I'll be honest. When in the past, whenever views on the Askeet and the Sealy non-Sealy code came up, I think I always slightly glossed over
Yeah.
in Kith books because I never really felt like, well, I'm playing my individual character. I want to make my mind up for that myself. But when it came to writing it for Dullahan, I suddenly, rather unexpectedly, found myself enjoying writing the section,
Mm.
since if the Dullahan are, to borrow a bit more werewolf terminology, if they're somewhat like the Philodox of the Fae as the judges, it makes sense that broadly speaking, the Kith have put a bit more thought into kind of the philosophies of the Fae. Yeah, it just suddenly became much more interesting because it was much more relevant to characters I was imagining with Dullahan. It became relevant. Why do we do this with the Sealy code, or why do we not do this with the unsealy code, and why do we enforce the Askeet? Because arguably the Dullahan are often responsible for enforcing the Askeet, and so all of a sudden it became quite relevant for a character to have actually had thoughts on this. Not saying that any player would absolutely have to, but it is. I felt like it suddenly became much more important to the Kith than I've felt those parts of other Kith books have been to other Kith. So I
Hmm.
had a lot of fun with that. So I hope that comes across in those
Yeah.
sections.
And ultimately, like any Kith, the Seelie and Unseelie code and the Askeet are both, all of them are open enough texts that any Kith can interpret them in their own very specific way. And I think that's definitely the same for the
Yeah.
Dullahan.
And you did a good job here of you have like a specific person saying what they think about each sort of section, sort of highlighting this is a thing that a dualhan could think, but not a straitjacket. So,
Hmm. I always thought that was one of my favorite parts of the way the Old World of Darkness books were written, was the fact that you never get an unbiased storyteller.
Yeah.
And I think especially with things like the Sealy Code and the Askeet, and oftentimes the history when you get into some of the books, I do think it's important to have a biased narrator because it makes it more like, at the end of the day, these books are there for the players and storytellers to be able to make their own stories. And if you box someone in by saying no, this is what they think and why they think it, then it makes the whole character creation process just that much more flat. But you can quite easily get around that by simply framing it with this is what this particular character does. And in fact, it makes, I think, those characters a bit more interesting, and some of them actually then pop up as NPCs later in the book.
Yeah. There's also interesting in the profiling part where they talk about like the other kiths and Gallain and whatnot, where it's getting into what's the jurisdiction. Do you see that as sort of a thing that like different dullahan would like argue with each other about, like on the edge cases and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. That was particularly when coming to the Nunnehi and some of the Gallain, where the Dullahan are very, as I was writing the book, I became keenly aware that the Dullahan are very, very much a Celtic kith. I mean, most of the, I think, core kith are to some degree, but the Dullahan are specifically from Irish folklore. And not wanting to open a can of worms about some of how, the Nunnehi have been written in the past, it just felt like probably the most appropriate way of putting it, that the Dullahan go, yeah, I mean, they're not our jurisdiction. They operate under their own rules, and I'm not really sure we have any right to cast judgment on them, and then left it at that.
They're more than happy to put judgment on the she, though.
Oh, yes.
Or the Thalane, that's the other.
Well, yeah, then there's a particular bugbear for the Dullahan and the Thalane in the form of the Nukkalavi.
Yeah, the other kith in this book.
Yes.
Or, tell us about the Nukkalavi and where that's from, like folklore wise.
So the Nukkalavi is actually another Celtic folklore originally from Scotland and the Orkney Isles. It is possibly the most horrific creature I think I've ever seen in folklore. If anyone has never heard of the Nukkalavi, it's kind of like a centaur gone horribly, horribly wrong. They have no skin, they come out of the ocean. The torso of the man is attached to the middle of the horse's back. The horse has one eye. I thought an interesting trait of the Nukkalavi in relation to the Dullahan actually is that it's always described as the head of the humanoid part of the creature rolls around as if the neck was broken, which it almost felt like it was alluding to the Dullahan, even though the head is attached to it. And they are always listed as these beings of corruption and hatred, and they are just there to cause pain and suffering. And I mentioned earlier how Crom Cruach was sort of the first example of what happens when this very high ideal of justice is corrupted. And without wanting to get political, I think it's true that today there's not much that we would view as more heinous than, with a few exceptions, I think, of something that a person who is meant to be upholding justice and fairness and righteousness abusing that position. And the Nukkalavi are born out of that when a Dullahan or a member of the Wild Hunt starts to abuse their power and the dream of justice. They start to corrupt, and eventually, and there's a flaw for this, similar to along the lines of the Dark Fate flaw, they might just ride into the ocean and emerge as this monster. And the Nukkalavi are definitely written to be antagonists. I don't think I'd ever let a player use a Nukkalavi, particularly because they're quite powerful. But they are meant to be just atrocious. And yeah, so they're in there.
The only time I can think of the Nukkalavi appearing in World of Darkness, actually, so going way back, there was a trilogy of novels that has been very specifically declared non-canon by White Wolf, but it was the Mask of the Red Death trilogy, which introduced the Niktuku, who are the Nosferatu uber antagonists in Vampire, and one of them is named Nukkalavi, the Skinless. So it's, I think that was the first place that I ever heard of it, and then kind of investigated the folklore around it. So it's nice to see them as a proper kith.
Nice.
Along with a full body illustration.
Yes. Well, a skinless full body.
Yeah. Which I had entirely too much fun doing, if I'm honest.
After Nukkalavi, we alluded to a lot of it on the Prodigals section. So, talks about ghosts and vampires and.
I like the ghost section specifically for. I understand what you're saying about not wanting to step on the toes of the Slua, but I imagine the Slua rarely get in touch with ghosts and then agree to take vengeance on whoever killed the person, you know? So
Yeah.
having another Kith kind of step into that role is a nice narrative option.
Mm-hmm.
And it would make for a really fun motley, I think, having
Yeah.
Slua and Dullahan working together with potentially with a Wraith crossover.
And the dullahan seem to be one of the few Kiths that actually like the red caps, so you could get a red cap in there too.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
as long as they don't treat them as a hunting hound.
Yeah.
Well, that was the Pooka that was the big problem, right?
Yeah, they're a bit split on the Pooka. But I feel like most people tend to be a bit split on the Pooka in game anyway.
It's terribly unjust.
Well, I mean, a lot of the original folklore you hear about Pooka have them turning into horses, which I felt could go one of two. I mean, the Pooka probably aren't overly keen on the Dullahan when it comes to that. I actually
Mm-hmm.
referenced that again with one of the treasures later in the book, the bridle. So I did specifically have the Dullahan say, if a Pooka turns into a horse and offers you a ride, don't trust it.
Mhm.
On the other hand, a bloodhound Pooka, for instance, might get along very well with a Dullahan
Mm-hmm.
hunter. So
And you had in the mage section. Are Dullahan sometimes working for paradox spirits? Is that
that that is basically what I'm implying there. Yes. Um, at one point, I ended up not including it, but I had a list of potential story prompts, and one of them was basically a paradox spirit shows up and says, "This mage has been bad. Go punish it." So yes, that is exactly what I was alluding to in there, and I quite like the idea of the Dullahan going, "I have no clue what's going on, but sure,
A job's a job.
job's a job."
Yeah, and then you have also on the church. I think you mentioned that before, but it's a different relationship than a lot of changelings.
Yeah,
There.
I wanted to touch on that partly because of Crom Cruach being tied in with St. Patrick in quite a lot of the stories I've read, but also because of how much through certainly Western and British history, the church, for better or for worse, has influenced the idea and as a result, the sort of changeling capital D dream of what justice, punishment, and judgment means, and what would be worthy, I suppose, of punishment or judgment and justice. So it felt important to reference that with the Dullahan, particularly again with this repeated theme of there's the ideal of justice and then there's the reality of it, and particularly the repeated theme of how far short the reality of it often falls than the claimed ideal. So yeah, having that little mention in there about the Dullahan having a slightly different relationship with the church because their dream had been so heavily influenced by it, whether they like it or not. Yeah, it just seemed important to touch on. Oh, and then again, it ties in with I mentioned the Central American folklore of Padre Sin Cabeza, one of the headless priest, which again sort of ties that in a bit more.
Yeah. So then we have a picture before chapter 2 of a most partly skeleton horse, which I know it's not really connected to the Dullahan, but like I just keep on thinking of Ivari Luid. Am I saying that right? The the Welsh horse head for Christmas thing.
Oh, those.
And I'm like, how would you tie that into this? I guess this is a unicorn skull head, but
Yeah, kind of. It wasn't anything in particular. It was what
yeah.
bits look. It's a lot of the time with the splash page watercolors. It's what makes for an evocative image.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I had originally done it without the horn on it, and then I thought, well, got some pretty emblematic steeds in this chapter. So if there's anything representative of a magical steed, it's a unicorn. So I sort of threw a horn onto the skull. But then the mane looks quite a bit, I think, like some was inspired by kelpies and water horses, whereas the body's kind of a nightmare. So he's a bit of a hodgepodge.
Yeah, I think it all works though. The nightmare unicorns, I think, just accentuate the nightmare horse thing when I've seen it before.
Yeah.
So then we have chapter 2, Wild Ride.
I was really happy to see the thorough investigation of Fey animals here because it's something that I've seen scraps of homebrew here and there. I've played in a game with a fey animal, and it's just never really been solidly developed. So I like the deep exploration of how they work in this
Yeah,
opening.
you can't just put everything on the Pooka and the Selkies. It doesn't.
Well, you can, but
But yeah, it doesn't. It comes out really.
yeah. So in essence, with the way the fey animals are presented here, they're changelings, in that they have a chimerical aspect and a fleshly aspect. They have banality and they have glamour, and they need glamour to survive. But beyond that, can you explain your conception for them and maybe talk a bit about how the dullahan get their steeds?
So I think going way back to the initial sort of seed of the whole Fey steed idea was the brief mention that they're given in Kingdom of Willows, which, as I've said before, I was and like you've said, I was never quite satisfied with just their brief mention and then not really being fleshed out. So I think they were mentioned as reincarnating with their Fey owners, having gone through the changeling way. So immediately you want to have a chimerical and a physical aspect, which was also part of the excuse for giving the dullahan the two freebie points towards the chimera background at creation. A lot of the time, their steed or their hound will reincarnate near them, which is how they will often start with get their steed. Not always, but could be how they start. I do talk about Fey breeding. The idea being, I feel like the dream of, yeah, I suppose the term would be the equine dream or the canine dream, is I feel like humanity's probably passionate enough about that still, just given the sheer number of movies about dogs and horses, that it is still possible for a new Fey animal to be born, just with quite low percentage chance. So there are, and I did include later, an NPC who's a horse breeder. They could end up with kinane horses, which I think I was influenced quite a bit by werewolf breeding mechanics for this one, somewhat. In that, so there's a much higher chance of getting a kinane steed, which just becomes a very exemplary animal, and so as a result, at least on the mortal side, you can get quite a good reputation for your horse stock. Or there's a low chance that it might breed true. I think they also mention in the Selkies somewhere that occasionally a seal is born that learns to shed its skin. So sort of that glimmer of hope that if there's a strong enough dream, whether that's that it is possible for new Fey souls to be born. I felt more so it would be easier for a horse or a hound, since they're not sentient in the same way that a changeling is. Yeah, I won't go too much into that because there's a whole other book project that I'll start yammering on about if I start talking about Fey animals too much.
Yeah, you've left the door open for fairy cats, even though they're
Oh
not in this
yes,
book, because yeah, they're not really dullahan
yeah.
things, but they'd be. Yeah,
There were a couple times writing this book where I had to go, no, I need to put that back on the shelf for another source book because otherwise this book will end up being 5 volumes and it's meant to just be a kith book. Well, I guess I will mention on the long list of changeling source books I would like to write for the Vault, I do have an outline for the Bayok Shi, which would be the Beast Fae, because there are just too many sentient Fae animals, like the Kotchi or the Kunanun or yeah, and the idea there would be actually fully sentient, playable changeling animals, but that's a whole other story.
Well, that also sounds like a big not stepping on puka toes, not stepping on werewolf and other shifter toes. Like,
Yeah, but and I can talk about that for a long time. So I will simply say that when writing Dullahan, I had to make a conscious decision to not start writing another book because this book already spawned a second spin-off that it wasn't supposed
yep,
to.
But you also leave a lot of room here to kind of attend to those mythological steeds. So, I mean, reading through this, the ones that popped into my mind. So one of the examples is the Hrimfaxi, which I believe is from Norse myth, and it made me think of Sleipnir, Odin's horse. I was thinking about Shadowfax from Lord of the Rings, and I also kind of desperately want a headless Santa with 8 reindeer steeds.
That wouldn't be hard to do, actually.
Yeah, I mean the mechanics are all there to put it together. So
Yeah.
that's a lot more on the coal delivery aspect, I think.
yes, well, but he's a figure of justice. So
Yep.
Yeah. There's that new movie coming out all about it. Was it Violent Night? There we go.
So I know this book's out. I do have a mechanical question that I
Yep.
couldn't tell from reading it, and maybe I missed it. What realm are these fairy steeds?
I would class them the same way as probably, like with changelings, they'd fall under Fae.
Okay,
Um,
like chimera, basically, or
yeah, essentially like Chimera. So I
and
think,
and then the same for the vehicles that come later. Okay,
yes. Yeah.
that makes sense. Yes.
I do like how we have walk, trot, and gallop separate movement mechanics. But also, just as kind of a devil's advocate question, compared with some of the other chimerical companions that this background would buy you, the steeds are rather strong by comparison. So, how would you suggest balancing that out? I mean,
Mm.
if the steeds are available to any other kith, why should or would anyone take a non steed companion, basically?
You mean take, for instance, a hound compared to a horse, or
Or like a bird, or just something that's less powerful, but
Or like a chimerical, like a purely chimerical animal, I guess is what you're getting at.
yeah.
I think the physical aspect of them, like you said, does give them a bit of power that a pure chimera wouldn't necessarily have.
Hmm.
Like you said, it does make them more powerful in that regard. However, it also does come with its own drawbacks. I did mention, I think, earlier in the book that dullahan often stay in rural environments because it's a bit difficult to just go riding wherever you like with a horse. So
Yeah, and you can't really bring your chimerical hound to class with you if you're in school.
yeah, exactly. But if you've got a genuine Fey hound that has a physical aspect to it, you can't really bring that with you. Again, it's sort of a pro and a con, which I would hope helps to balance them out a bit. I would say, I think one of the questions we had written down was to perhaps think about if you're fitting a dullahan into a game. And I think one of the biggest bits of advice I'd say would be to think about how your chimerical companion is going to fit in
Hmm.
to the game you're playing. So similar to maybe how if you're playing D&D, you're playing a ranger, your companion's quite a big part of that. If you're playing even more so, if you're playing a dullahan, if you're going to be playing a game set inside of a freehold and there's going to be a lot of intrigue, you might
Mm-hmm.
perhaps not want to have a horse because it's going to be outside in the stable most of the time.
Mm.
But that might be a great place to have a fey hound that can sniff things out. Or if you're going to be on a big cross-country quest, then yeah, go for it. Have your dragon horse or your phantom big rig trucking along with
Yeah,
you.
kind of reminds me a bit of if you want to bring a Gillidu or even kind of a Selkie or something in your game. There's like, I mean, it's true for any kith. You could go, this kith doesn't, or this character doesn't really fit, but this is much more. You really have to either make the game around it, or it has to have been something that fits it.
Yeah, it's definitely something I think that both player and storyteller would want to have at least given a bit of thought to before deciding on exactly what they're going to be using as the companion.
Well, since you've alluded to the other two, perhaps we can talk briefly about Feyhounds and Phantom Vehicles. I like that there's an entire system for teaching new tricks to Feyhounds. Again, a use for animal ken.
Yeah, I just tried to think of what are you going to want to do with your Feyhound, and immediately having run games before and also having been that player, I know someone's going to ask, "Oh, I want my hound to go do this,"
Hmm.
and for the sake of everyone's sanity, it just seemed like that would be an important thing to include in the mechanics at the start of the chapter.
Yeah, and something that could conceivably be applied to other sorts of animal. But I'll admit, the Phantom Vehicles are the ones that I was really into because, as much as, in the classical folklore, there are plenty of Fey steeds and Fey hounds to draw upon, but then in modern media, you have Knight Rider and Christine and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and even the Mirthmobile from Wayne's World, like all of these sort of vehicles in movies and TV shows that I could see being transposed into.
Oh, now I want a combination of the two, and like you have a knocker who's like really updated his Roomba, and now that's like a mechanical hound type thing.
For example.
Yeah.
Yep. The Phantom vehicles, I think, were. I mean, they're probably responsible for the birth of the Paved with Good Intentions book,
Mhm.
almost single handedly. Yeah, the idea that again you mentioned Ghost Rider, that other rider.
Mhm.
I mean, Knight Rider also fits with this, but
Yep.
yeah.
almost the Mystery Machine, or I think
Yes.
Well,
that,
the hypercar, that's basically Kit. So
yeah, Metallica was definitely from Supernatural. Was
mhm.
a bit of the inspiration behind the shady black sedan. I always come back to what is the sort of the mortal dream, capital D, that has inspired behind something. And especially when I was thinking about the Fey horses, just how quickly that had been overshadowed by the dream of the open road and the cars. And suddenly you have all this folklore. I think I came across some of it actually when I was starting to look into headless rider urban legends. But people sort of, you have ghostly motorcycles with headless riders, or phantom vehicles, which is where the name came from, sort of strange black cars with tinted windows that seem to drive themselves and disappear through walls, and they often get referenced as ghosts, but the urban legends are vague enough and the dream strong enough that it seemed appropriate that it might make that jump. And you can definitely see it there, with sort of just the human mindset. Many of us name our cars. I had a friend at university who absolutely named her car, and in fact, that car ended up becoming a sentient NPC in one of our mage games. Because what happens when a mage and a bunch of changelings keep talking to a car like it's a sentient real thing? It becomes a sentient real thing.
Natch.
Magic happens with a K.
Yep.
So the phantom vehicles are the mechanical equivalent of the Fey steeds. They have a physical body, not a fleshy one, but a mechanical one, as well as a chimerical aspect. They can move around on their own, but I actually went to quite great lengths about writing why they prefer not to.
Hmm.
So it is essentially like another steed, but it's a car instead of or a motorcycle instead of a horse.
Yeah. This section, I think, this Kith book, in a good way, as probably the most crunchy of Kith books in Changeling.
Yeah.
With the vehicle rules, everything seems good to me when I'm reading it, and I don't think it's going to be like too much for a game because most of it's stuff you kind of figure out at character creation. But it's
Yep.
just kind of laughing at looking at all the charts and stuff.
I mentioned earlier the other source book I wrote in the middle of writing Kithbook Dullahan was Paved with Good Intentions, and that came about specifically when I got to the end of this chapter and had thought, well, I'll just quickly summarize the driving and riding mechanics because it's going to come up if you're playing a Dullahan, and as a player or storyteller, I'd want them on hand. And then there was one fateful evening where I think I had 5 different source books open in front of me on the living room floor. I think I had mage, vampire, werewolf, changeling, hunter. I think I had Dark Ages vampire open on a PDF, and not one of the books agreed on how to drive or ride. Everyone had a different mechanic. Everyone had a slightly different slant on it. And so then I thought, well, I'll take the bits that work and I'll try to cobble it together because I can imagine, again, I hate when the mechanics grind a game to a halt because you've landed in a scenario like you're in a high speed chase. If you have a hypercar or a motorcycle that shoots flames, you want to be in a high speed chase. But what
Mm-hmm.
happens when the entire gaming session grinds to a halt because you have no rules to go off of? But you also don't want them so crunchy that you can't play anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
tried to summarize them, and the chapter got bigger and bigger until eventually it popped off and became its own book, which is paved with good intentions, not nearly as polished as Dullahan because I just wanted to have the rules.
So is that like an expansion on this section, or is it?
Kind of. I intentionally held back stuff about Changeling specifically. It really became how to hash out things like stunt driving. Some very wonderful people play tested it for me. So things like the handling, durability, and structure of vehicles was thoroughly analyzed and experimented with, and cruise speed and max speed. Paved also contains some more stuff on riding. So there's stuff on there's rules for jousting there and mounted combat. There's stuff for stats for horse-drawn vehicles because it annoyed me that there was nothing at all for
Oh yeah,
what if you want to drive a stagecoach.
you need that for a headless horseman too. Yeah,
Yep.
there's a.
So rather, but it would have absolutely tripled the size of this book, and
Mm-hmm.
the rules also are not really specific to any one game line. And there were some things I really wanted to There's a lot of fun things I came across, such as what happens when you have a vampiric ghoul steed or a revenant breed of horses, or specific gifts for werewolves to do with driving. So there's a little section in the back of Paved that is specific to some of the game lines, including Mage, which has sort of the spiritual equivalent, the sort of brothers of the Phantom vehicle, called alternate engines, which are vehicles with magical powers, essentially, that mages can take. Some of them might look oddly similar to some of the Phantom vehicles, such as the Shady Black Sedan, which had to go in there for anyone playing a Technocrat. So, but I did hold back most of the Changeling stuff to put into Kithbook Dullahan, since that was where it all started, and I really wanted to keep it in this book.
Yep. But you could probably, it sounds like you could, if you had both books, you could definitely use them well together.
Oh, absolutely. Kithbook Dullahan is not a reprint of Paved with Good Intentions. If you want a bit more of the crunch on driving or riding to augment what's in Dullahan, I hope I've included enough in Dullahan that you don't have to buy Paved. I included like the basic summary of riding and driving in Dullahan in little sidebars. There's a charts, basic charts for the vehicles if you want to build your own Phantom vehicle, including Chimera point cost, because I hate sitting down and having to do maths on that. So those charts are in Dullahan. If you wanted to go even deeper into that, then I would strongly recommend Paved with Good Intentions.
Link will be provided in the show notes.
Woo.
I have another question about this chapter. There's a lot of details about equestrianism and car culture and all that stuff. Like, do you have any personal interest or hobby or whatever in some of these areas, or is this all sort of research for the book?
I think the best answer to that is that I didn't have an interest in them. I, I think one of my favorite things about Changeling is that something can seem quite boring to you, to borrow the term. It could be quite banal. And then you meet someone who, to them, it is the font of all glamour. And when they talk about it and you see it through their eyes, it starts to become that for you. Grant, I had been around horses a bit growing up. My sister was really big into horse riding, so I've seen a bit of that passion before. So that was less of a surprise. I think it was the cars that was the surprise. I'd never really been the type to be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go hang out in the garage and tinker with the vehicle. And yet now I've gone and started taking classes to learn how to drive a motorcycle. And
Mm.
actually last weekend was out on the course on the motorcycle, and got to the point where they're like, right, open it up, get a bit faster, speed, like get up to 30 going down here. And there was this moment where it suddenly clicked and I went, oh, I see why this is why you want your skeleton cycle or be cruising down 66 on your Hell's Hot Rod. Like, okay, I think I see the dream of the open road now. So the dreams are there. You just kind of have to find someone that sees them like that, and then they can share it with you. Somewhere there's a knocker that got a big boost of glamour from me last weekend.
So then we have Chapter 3, Highwayman's Horde, where we have some Dullahan of Renown, we have some crunchy bits. So among the Dullahan of Renown, I don't know, Josh, did you have a favorite?
Well, it's been mentioned several times, the Padre Ricardo.
Yeah.
But I just want to say one other thing that hasn't been mentioned so far. It's also such a superhero character concept. I love it when I see that in Changeling. Like the secret identity and going out and fighting crime while the daytime you have your day job. Like this needs to be like a new superhero in some comic book or something. Or maybe there already is one because it's based on an actual folklore. So
Well, the superhero aspect less so, but the Padres Sin Cabeza folklore, some of them seem to spawn from punishment, where a corrupt priest has gone and he's had a bit of poetic justice, and now he wanders headless. But some other ones do paint them more like the old Dullahan stories, as these harbingers and warnings of punishment and judgment to the wicked. I should preface this by saying I was very lucky in that I got to live in Central America for 2 years, once in for a year teaching in Honduras, and then for a year in Nicaragua. And I really wanted. I mean, the the Padre Ricardo character. He's actually named after someone I knew in Honduras, and yeah, he's a bit of a love letter to Central America. There's not much more I can say about him. I think he was my favorite NPC as well. I tried to sum up the kind of can-do vigilante attitude that I think many of the some of the people in the culture down there I knew, and I just love that character, and it was so much fun painting that picture as well.
I just want to know how he gets away with. There's a note here that he leaves his head safely in the church tower when he goes out on a quest of punishment. And given what we've seen about the headlessness mechanics, wouldn't that be distracting? Or
It would certainly be problematic.
it's not a bad idea for him, I
Yeah.
think, by any means. Just it must be difficult to be a superhero when your head is back in the church.
Definitely, and I think he would rely a lot on shock value and his chimerical companion, the
Yeah.
Cadejo, which is also a fairly well-known Central American bit of folklore. Some of the NPCs I allude to things that I just then don't explain, largely because of rule of cool, and
Mm-hmm.
if they were dropped into an actual game, would probably require a little bit more ironing out.
Yeah, Nina Headless 823 also stuck out to me as that.
Yeah.
Like, wait, how does that work?
I very nearly opened another can of worms with her quote unquote Trojan horse steed, and decided, nope, you know what? This is going to be one of those tantalizing bits that maybe one day I'll flesh out, but just sounds really cool, and I'm just going to
Yeah.
leave it there.
I like that there's actually the inclusion of a Dantean as well.
I was about to say that this is my favorite Dantean I've ever encountered.
She was actually inspired by a Dauntain in the old Autumn People book. There was a Dauntain there that had the attitude of he'd witnessed some changelings going basically just high on glamour and running rampant, and saw some people get hurt at a concert as a result, and so then turned against the Fae. And yeah, Seraphine is very much that dialed up to 11, plus perhaps a little bit of Dean Winchester from Supernatural riding around in her car. But yeah, I tried with the NPCs to really think of different ways that the dream of judgment and justice could be played out. Judgment on the Fae seemed like a particularly fascinating one to play around with, since it's very easy to look at the changelings and go, they're sort of the bright, colourful, sparkly bits of the world of darkness, and sometimes forget that actually they can be just as monstrous as anyone else because they're born from dreams of humans who can be just as monstrous. So yeah, that's where Seraphine came in at the end. Plus, again, it was just a really fun piece of watercolor to paint.
Yeah. Following the NPCs, we have the Wild Hunt Society, and again, this is one of those things that pops up regularly across the books, but is never really fleshed out in a satisfactory way. So here they're presented as an actual Fae society, complete with boon and ban and recruitment and rituals, and it's a nice, I think, write up for that concept. A good story hook for a motley as well.
Yeah, the moment I got to that, I was like, oh, this is a perfect use for a society. Because, like, I sort of looked at them in, like, C20 player guide. I'm like, oh, okay. But this is, like,
Yeah.
perfect. Like, it's this group that's been alluded to before, but
And elsewhere, it's often presented as almost a traditional activity rather than an ongoing group. So having that change as well is interesting.
yeah, I guess the one question there's no connection here though with what beasties do, right? With their wild hunt.
Well, but see, that's one of the many occasions when it's popped
Yeah.
up without much more explanation. So,
Mm-hmm.
presumably the beasties and the dullahan don't go riding together.
I wouldn't imagine so, but I could see a particularly dark, perhaps like a member of the Shadow Court Dullahan might go riding with a beastie. I
Mm-hmm.
would not want to fall afoul of that hunting party.
No.
That could actually make for a really interesting antagonist in a game. Now that you mention it, but I don't think they'd fit into the Wild Hunt Society specifically
No.
because again of the dream that the society's pulling on. Yeah, so again, in the early stages of research of riders and the Fae, the Wild Hunt came up quite a lot. Actually, even in folklore, It's alluded that there might be some connections there with the dullahan folklore. We're not entirely sure, but there was enough there for me to go, this really needs to be in the book somewhere. And yeah, I hope the society seemed like a good outbox for it.
And it's a good reason to have connections with other kiths as well, since you mentioned she and trolls might also be in the society, and it opens it up for other characters to have that fey steed or fey hound companion as a background.
Mm-hmm.
Then we get some merits and flaws, my favorite of which is absolutely hard-headed, purely for the visual of a dullahan throwing their head as a missile at people.
Which shows up in folklore again a
For
surprising
sure.
amount. In fact, I think in one early draft I had that they could just do that as part of their birthright, and it just got a bit silly.
Hmm.
So quite a number of the merits are actually drawn from the folklore and kind of early editions of the Dullahan birthrights. There's some great stories of Dullahan and skeletons, I think, having parties and going bowling with their heads. So yeah, hard headed, just it needed to be in there just to
Yeah.
enable a player to have that fun if they wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the Verdant mean the tie with the Green Man thing. That was an interesting other piece of folklore to tie in with the Dullahan.
Yeah, the Gawain and the Green Knight is a story that popped up a lot in the research, and I just wasn't quite sure what to do with it because while it very much has that theme of kind of testing the virtuous, it completely didn't fit in with the sort of spooky Halloweeny vibe that the rest of the Dullahan have. When suddenly you have this foresty green man figure. Verdant Main is actually a merit that I stole from my previous book that I co-authored, Roots of Legend, which is all about fairy forests, enchanted forests. There's a bunch of new forest-related kith, and we included Verdant Main as an option for if you wanted to have a fae that was particularly aligned with the woods, with the green dream. And so I took it and just sort of cut it down and edited it a bit to fit more neatly into Kithbook Dullahan as a nod, yeah, to the Gawain mythos that pops up so much when it comes to headless folk.
Yeah, it was my favorite flaw here, like away in shame. I love that kind of flaw, and I feel like Changeling needs like a core kith based around something like that because it's just so fairy in my mind. Yeah,
I will readily admit that my favorite part of this chapter is the treasures. All of these are things that I could see incorporating into a game in several different ways. I do kind of have the idea with the burning horseshoes treasure that allows a chimerical steed to run through the air with leaving a fiery trail behind. I'd also like that to be adapted into burning hubcaps so that your
yeah.
vehicle can fly into the air.
You're not the first person in the week that this book has been out to suggest that to me, so it's
Excellent.
Yeah.
absolutely someone could do that. And I think that would be. I think someone said they wanted to put it on. One friend said they wanted to put those onto a DeLorean.
Nice. Or it's like when you see those hydraulic lifts that have like the neon lighting and stuff, it's that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah. I like the treasures in general that you're not following the C20 core book thing of treasures are just
Oh, yeah.
arts. Like they're actually evocative and interesting effects and things like that.
As treasures should be.
yeah,
Yes.
I think so. They're almost, especially as they get more powerful, they almost become plot hooks in and of themselves.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's something I loved about the old Kith books was how they would always include a sort of Kith legendary item.
Yes.
Hmm.
But yeah, this section is my favorite. And then we close out with a range of templates.
Yeah, I like these.
I
These
was
kind of
quite fond of the sort of Green Knight Eco Defender because, of course, that would be my favorite.
the picture of a dog, a kid with a dog holding his head is just like it's so
Yeah.
creepy and so like what the heck, and then it's like, oh, but it really fits this kith, so it's
That one actually terrified me. I think of all of the different template Dullahan that I wrote up, I think that kid, the Tiny Terror, was the one that I found most the one I would least want to meet,
hmm
um,
Mhm.
particularly because of the idea of good and bad being that simple and black and white, and then having the power to enforce that. just it starts drifting into the Shining territory. And
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's like the girl on the tricycle in the opening.
Each template, again, much like with the Sealy Code and the Askeet viewpoints, was taking a particular idea and view on judgment and justice, and kind of spinning that out into a character, which a lot of the time can be it's not a simple idea, and particularly because when it's made into a simple idea, it becomes so horrific and so
Yeah,
easy to abuse.
it's kind of ironic of all these like sample sample characters. The one that would be, if I knew the details of what was going on, that would least scare me is the headless horror.
Mm-hmm.
Which, cause just like, oh, he's just looking for his head. He's got a nice dog, you know. He's probably the most frightening to come across in the middle of the night.
But he just wants to find his head.
He's even got a bag for it for when he finds it.
Yep.
Like Walter Raleigh. And that brings us to a lovely ad for Paved with Good Intentions.
Which has a hyperlink.
Ooh. And that's it. That's the book. So overall, you had mentioned earlier the D&D Ranger connection. I actually felt a lot of Paladin energy from this, and the classic, especially like 2nd edition D&D Paladin, which is what I grew up with. So that every Paladin, serving justice, but then they all have their steed that they have this deep connection to. That was the vibe I got, which I was into. But I also like the wide range of types that the dullahan trope can cover. So you can get a cold-blooded Hell's Angel biker type, or like Christopher Walken as the Headless Horseman in Sleepy Hollow, that whole aspect. But then you also have the noblest of knights possibility, or it makes me think of the category of saints called the cephalophores, that one of their tropes is carrying their own head. So it's a very wide set of possibilities, which I think is good for a kith to have, even if they have a particular aspect to them that defines them, like the headlessness does here. Those are my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to wait a few days to be sure, but I think you've written my favorite Kith book.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much.
Maybe not my favorite Kith. Like, I like the Kith, but there's other Kiths that are like dear to my heart. But the treatment of this is just wow.
They'd make good allies for Ishu. They'd make good managers for redcaps. They'd make good foils for trolls.
Some of them make good customers for knockers.
Yeah. Good enemies for she who have reason to fear, etc. So yeah,
definitely. I really like this book. If you're listening to this, I suggest you check it out.
Again, links will be in the show notes.
Yes. So, was there any other projects you're working on, Andrew, that you'd wanted to either came out recently or came out at some point or coming out soon? Or
Yeah, well, I mentioned obviously Paved with Good Intentions quite a bit, which is not for any particular sort of 20th anniversary generic rules for driving and riding. I think it's a useful book if you need that for a game, or at the very least gives you something to go off of. The first vault book, so Dullahan is the third book now that I've put on the vault. The first one called Roots of Legend, which I co-wrote and illustrated with Aaron Siddall, and it's all about enchanted forests. I mentioned we've got a bunch of new kith in there. We've got rules for fairy gardens. We've got mechanics for potion brewing. So that was a really fun project to do. Going forward, I've alluded to it already, but the first ever book I had started writing was probably going on 15 years ago, before the Vault was even a thing, back on the old Shadownescence forum.
Memories.
yeah, we were both there.
Was when I was living in Central America and just fell in love with the culture and the folklore, and started working on a book just for fun for Kingdom of the Feathered Serpent. And I'd been working on and off again on that book for a while, and then made friends through some changeling forums who live in Mexico, or who are of Latin American descent, and they started giving input, and it has since grown and grown and grown into now I've got a fairly detailed outline for a 3-volume deep dive into the kingdoms of the Feathered Serpent, which would be a setting for Central America, spanning from the Mexican-American border down to Panama. And I think that will probably be the next one that I will dive into. It's quite a big undertaking, but it is a very big passion project of mine. If the Padre Ricardo NPC was a love letter, this one's going to be a whole sonnet, several sonnets. And I just really want to try and do justice, pardon the pun, to presenting the really rich culture rich cultures, sorry, that are down there, both for people who haven't had the opportunity to visit down there or to get to even start to get to know it, but also for the many Changeling players and World of Darkness players that live in those regions and who I hope would derive a lot of joy out of that book. Yeah, so that'll probably be the next big one. And I've got a list of about 30 projects that I'd love to do, most of which are Changeling, including a Changeling cookbook, which never happened. Also ends up having actual game mechanic stuff, because I can't write a book without adding more kith. Yes, there are food-related fairies.
Not all boggins. Okay.
The original idea for it was going to include a ritual for boggins to purify cast iron to be able to use it, and then I discovered in C20 that cast iron doesn't count as cold iron, so the whole idea went out the window.
You could still throw in the history. Like there's a story about how steel was tamed by the Dougal. So then you could have like this epic thing that was done by the Boggins for cast iron.
That would be quite fun. Oh yeah, the Bayok Shi book for playing things like Kot Shi, Ektaned, the Kunanoon, salamanders. Because why would all the Fae be human-shaped?
Mm-hmm.
Pooka there, but like you said, there are definitely stories of fairies that aren't humanoid, but are very much sentient beings in their own right. Like I said, I've got a lot of ideas, a lot of dreams to write up.
We will keep our eyes peeled. More Changeling content. Yes.
Always needs to be more.
So is there anywhere people could find you online to see what you're working on or get in contact with you?
Yeah, I've got a professional Instagram, I suppose, would be a.goodman.illustrates. Look me up and follow me there. I put all of the stuff I'm doing for Changeling illustrations on there. Otherwise, you can find me on the Storyteller's Vault.
Again, links in the show notes.
Yeah. So that I think wraps up this continuously spoopy episode of Changeling the Podcast. You can find us at changelingthepodcast.com. You can follow us on Twitter at changelingcast. You can email us at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. You can find our Discord from our website, changelingthepodcast.com. And we have a Facebook page, Changeling the Podcast.
All of which are also linked in the show notes.
Yes. So once again, thank you, Andrew.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Until next time, I'm Josh, and with us is also Pooka.
So they say.
And until next time,
don't lose your head.
If you're not using headless horsemen, fairy hounds, or back-talking boats in your Changeling Chronicle, we'd like to first ask, why ever not? And to second ask, have you considered dullahan as an addition to your eerie Halloween road trip-themed one-shot? But aside from questions such as these, as always, this outro gives us the opportunity to thank our patrons who make this show possible. Derek, Raz Caboose, Sanchiger, Seja, and Terry Robinson. You too can support this podcast and the dreaming-flavored tidbits we bring you by leaving a review on the platform of your listening convenience, passing it along to a friend, or becoming a patron yourself at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Whichever of these paths you choose, remember that the headless, mostly headless, or at least pumpkin-headed vigilante nightmare will always be just around the bend, waiting for you. Let that cheerful thought carry you forward. Until next time.